Hello friends, and welcome back to Amy Lynn Creative. In today's video, we are talking about why I switched from a Sony camera back to Canon. But this discussion would not be complete without a discussion of how I ended up with a Sony camera in the first place. I have been a die-hard Canon user since I was very young. My very first point and shoot was a Kodak, and then my second point and shoot was a Canon, and I haven't looked back since. So from a little Canon Power Shot to a Canon 50D to a 5D Mark II to a 5D Mark III and now a Canon R Mirrorless, I am pretty heavily invested in Canon in general. I love the brand, I love the cameras, I especially love Canon Color Science, and I have tried other camera brands along the way and just haven't loved them as much. So let's talk about Sony. That was a little bit of a spoiler alert. Let's talk about Sony and how I ended up with a Sony camera. A couple of years ago, I was talking to a friend about getting into video. I had shadowed for a wedding and really loved Sony and how Sony worked for video. My Canon 5D Mark III only does autofocus video, so I was going to need a camera that could do video if I wanted to learn video or do autofocus video. The Canon 5D Mark III does do manual video, not super helpful when you're doing video of people. So I happened to be at my favorite local camera store, and they had a Sony AR2 for sale, and it was a really good deal. So I ended up buying a Sony Mirrorless camera so that I could use it for video. I bought a couple lenses to go with them, just kind of lower end lenses that I could get started with, and added that to my collection of Canon gear. I've used that camera for a couple of years for various video projects, a lot of weddings. I loved the camera for video, but I just really, it wasn't clicking. No pun intended. There's something wrong with it. It was creating great video, but it just wasn't my favorite camera. My Canon was still my absolute favorite, even though it was older, an older model, and it just wasn't working for me. Another reason, so I had to make a decision. I was at a point where I needed to either further invest in Sony gear, or I needed to get rid of my Sony camera and upgrade my Canon gear. So I'm going to kind of walk you through the process of why I switched. Spoiler alert, it wasn't because of the specs, and it wasn't because Sony is not a fantastic line of cameras. They are still on the leading edge of mirrorless technology, and honestly, I really wanted to love them. I really wanted to love Sony. If you line up the specs, if you line up the Sony specs with the Canon EOS R that I purchased, actually, some of the things, the Sony wins out. So the Sony model that I purchased, even though it was 3 years older, actually had some better specs than Canon. So on the surface, you'd say, well, definitely go with the Sony. But there's more to it than that. So the first thing I looked at was I compared the specs of 3 cameras, my Sony, my EOS R, and my 5D Mark III, which was my lead body at the time. Now, my favorite way to do this, recently discovered the dpreview.com camera comparison feature. It is really cool. You can type in the model of your camera and compare them side by side. They're not paying me to tell you this. I just really love it. It's really handy because then you can just line up the specs and just kind of look across and see. So it was really important to me that my new camera be at least an upgrade from my current body, not necessarily the Sony. I was just really looking to switch, and I wanted to make sure that Sony wasn't like worlds and worlds better to the point where it was irresponsible to not stay with Sony as far as image quality went. So I was pleasantly surprised, and I'm going to go into the other reasons I didn't switch in a minute. Okay, so when I was looking at the pros and cons, one of the things I considered was Canon Color versus Sony Color. I really love the Canon Color Science, and while the Canon R isn't quite as amazing as the Mark III, they really nailed the color science. I'm really gonna miss it, but the Sony, I just never loved the colors. I know you can set auto white balance or custom white balance and all that. I just really didn't love the color science. So that was just kind of a small thing for me, but I do shoot true to color. and very vibrant, saturated images. So the color is really important to my style of photography. I don't shoot dark and moody. I don't shoot super light and airy. So color science was a really big deal. The next thing was that Sony's menus are ridiculous. They don't seem intuitive. Not that Canons do either, but across cameras, when I would rent additional equipment for a wedding, guys, the menus were totally different. Like, totally mind-blowingly different. Whereas Canon kind of, and like buttons were all in different places. I mean, Canon kind of does that too, but not to the same level. When you pick up a Canon camera, if you pick up another Canon camera, it's pretty quick and easy to figure out. Whereas with video, if I was renting additional equipment, I really had to sit down and like go through the menus and match things up and like spend a lot of time thinking about it. And then I would not switch back and forth on a wedding day because things were just too different. So I liked the Canon menus. I like how the Canon buttons are laid out. Another thing about Sony camera bodies that I don't love, their mirrorless line, is they're actually not as, I don't find them to be as ergonomic. So I really, some people really like that the Sony Mirrorless doesn't look like a DSLR at all. It doesn't even resemble a DSLR, and it doesn't have as much of a grip. The Sony, well, it doesn't look as streamlined. The grip feels very similar to my 5D Mark III. So while it is smaller, it is very similar to a DSLR feel, and I really like the way it grips. The grip is really important to me because when I'm doing photo over video, obviously I'm using a monopod or my gimbal, I use a wrist strap. I don't use a neck strap or a harness because I have back and shoulder tension, video about that coming soon, but I use a wrist strap. So the grip of the camera body was actually really, really important because I'm holding it all day long even when I'm not necessarily using it. The other thing I want to touch on is that one of my big concerns was financial. Because I was already really invested in the Canon system, I have a lot of Canon lenses. They would have been expensive to switch. I would have had to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on new Sony equipment, and it wasn't worth it. There weren't enough tech specs that I loved more in order to make that level of a switch. And the fact that I already had Canon lenses and that I could use the adapter on the EOS R, so I wouldn't need any new lenses. One thing I want to touch on with tech specs, this is not a video for gearheads. If you are a gearhead and you love tech specs and that's your favorite thing in the world, you're going to be really disappointed with this video. So just move on, find another one. There's so many videos talking about tech specs. This is the slightly less techy side of choosing new gear, because you also have to make smart business decisions and decisions that are right for you personally, not always based on the specifications, because while numbers don't lie, there's also other concerns, and sometimes what makes sense for you and your business don't always make sense on paper. So that's kind of something I want to encourage you with, is like Sony versus Canon on paper, maybe Sony wins, but for my business, it doesn't. Anyway, one tech spec thing that I did want to mention, because if there are techie people watching this, they're going to ask me, both cameras, the EOS R that I ended up going with and the Sony 7R2, they both shoot full frame and they both shoot 4K. The big difference is the Canon R shoots cropped 4K. So it actually crops the video to, I think, according to YouTube, is about 1.8 times, which is a pretty significant crop. The reason I wasn't bothered by this is I still shoot in 1080p. I know that everyone is switching to 4K and even 8K for the video that I do right now, my YouTube channel, and small brand videos for small businesses. I don't feel the need to shoot in 4K. Don't hate me. Don't write a million comments telling me I need to shoot in 4K. I will eventually switch to 4K. I'm not there yet. I'm not there with my editing ability as far as my computer goes. One of the reasons, well, I'll go into that in a future video, but there are cameras I haven't purchased because the video files will crash my computer. For me and my business right now, I do not need 4K. And if I am in a situation where I do, I can use a wider lens and the cropped video is fine. So that is why I switched from Sony back to Canon. I hope you found this video helpful as far as what is right for your business and for your needs. And please let me know in the comments if you like this video, or just hit the like button. Thanks for joining.